The morning her grandmother died, Marisol Reyes was standing in the parking lot of a discount grocery store, counting coins in her palm and trying to decide between a bag of rice and a can of beans. She chose the rice. She always chose the rice. It stretched further, fed the girls longer, sat heavier in small stomachs that could not afford to feel empty. She tucked the bag under her arm and walked the 6 blocks home because the bus fare was $1.50 and she did not have $1.50 to spare, and the afternoon sun pressed down on her shoulders with the kind of weight that had nothing to do with heat. Her phone rang just before she reached the apartment steps. It was her Aunt Celia, and Marisol knew from the first syllable, from the way her aunt drew breath before speaking, the way she always did when delivering news she had already made peace with, that something had ended. Lola Caring was gone. Quietly, they said, in her sleep. At 81 years old, in the same narrow bed she had occupied for decades in the house on Sampaguita Street that smelled of Vicks and dried herbs and the faint ghost of wood smoke. Gone like a candle that had burned all the way down to its base and simply stopped. No drama, no final words, just an absence where a presence had been. Marisol sat on the bottom step of her apartment building and held the bag of rice against her chest and did not cry. Not because she did not grieve. She grieved enormously, in the way that people grieve for the last person in their life who had never once looked at them with disappointment. But she had learned, somewhere in the years between her husband leaving and the second eviction notice and the night her younger daughter woke with a fever and she had no money for medicine and spent 3 hours pressing a damp cloth to the child's forehead and praying. She had learned that grief was a luxury that required stillness, and stillness was something she could not yet afford. She had 2 daughters. Jasmine was 9 and Clara was 6, and they were waiting upstairs with a neighbor's teenage son who charged $3 an hour and had been known to fall asleep on the couch within 40 minutes. They were everything. They were also, on most days, the only reason Marisol continued to believe that the effort of waking up was worth it. She was 34 years old, and she felt 60. The wake was held 3 days later in the province, and Marisol borrowed money from a co-worker to buy bus tickets because she could not bring herself to explain to her daughters why they would not be saying goodbye to the only grandmother they had ever truly known. The bus ride was 4 hours, and Clara slept against her arm the whole way, and Jasmine stared out the window with the kind of quiet that older children develop when they sense that the adults around them are barely holding together. The house on Sampaguita Street was full when they arrived. Aunts and uncles and cousins and distant relatives who appeared only at baptisms, weddings, and funerals, and who spoke to Marisol with the particular warmth reserved for people whose struggles are considered their own fault. Her brother Dante was there, older by 4 years, broader across the shoulders, standing near the door with a glass of Coke and the easy confidence of someone whose life had arranged itself into stability without too much effort. He had a house in a subdivision. He had a car with functioning air conditioning. He had a wife who wore fresh clothes to every occasion and 2 sons who attended private school and a job in logistics that apparently paid very well and had for a long time. Marisol had not asked him for money after the second time. He said yes with such visible reluctance that accepting it felt worse than not having it. Her sister Rochelle was there too, younger by 2 years, living in Cebu with a boyfriend who was almost certainly going to become a husband and who worked in real estate and had already bought them a condo near the waterfront. Rochelle wore sunglasses pushed up on her head like a headband and hugged Marisol briefly and said you looked tired, and then moved on to speak with someone else. The reading of the will, if it could be called that, happened on the second day, after the burial, when the relatives had eaten and the dishes had been cleared and the children had been sent to play in the yard. Lola Caring had not had a lawyer. What she had was a handwritten document witnessed by the barangay captain and the old woman who sold vegetables at the end of the street, and it was read aloud by Uncle Ferdy, who was the oldest surviving sibling and held that position with considerable gravity. The house went to Dante. This surprised no one. Dante was the eldest grandson and had always been Lola Caring's practical favorite, the one who fixed the roof when it leaked and sent money for the electric bill without being asked. The small parcel of land behind the house went to Rochelle. A gold necklace and a rosary went to Aunt Celia. Various small items were distributed among cousins in a way that felt both arbitrary and final. And then Uncle Ferdy paused, cleared his throat, and looked at Marisol. To Marisol, the document said, I leave the tin bread box that is kept on the third shelf of the kitchen cabinet, behind the cooking oil. She will know what it is. She will know why. The room went very quiet for approximately 2 seconds. And then Dante laughed first. It was not a cruel laugh, not exactly. It was the laugh of someone genuinely surprised by something absurd, the kind that escapes before manners can intercept it. Rochelle pressed her lips together, but her eyes were bright with something that looked uncomfortably close to amusement. Several cousins exchanged glances. Aunt Celia looked at her hands. A bread box, someone said, just loudly enough to be heard. Marisol said nothing. She kept her face still and her spine straight, and she looked at the doorway because it was easier to look at doorways than at people who were waiting to see how she would react to being left a piece of tin. Later, in the kitchen, she found the shelf that had been described. Behind a large bottle of cooking oil, pushed far back against the wall as if it had been deliberately hidden in plain sight, sat the bread box. It was old. Not charmingly old. Not vintage the way people said about things they wanted to sell at a premium, but genuinely, unbeautifully old. The kind of old that meant decades of grease and dust and kitchen smoke. The tin was a dull reddish color beneath the grime, rectangular, roughly the size of a large shoebox, with a hinged lid that had rusted along its seam. The clasp had been sealed, not with a lock, but with what appeared to be several layers of black electrical tape wound tightly around the entire box. It was the tape that stopped her from being entirely dismissive. Lola Caring had wrapped this box the way you wrapped something you did not want opened by accident or by casual curiosity. The tape was old too, dried at the edges, but the layers were deliberate. Someone had come back to this box more than once. She carried it to where her daughters were sitting and tucked it into the canvas bag she had brought and said nothing about it to anyone. On the bus ride home, with Clara asleep again and Jasmine watching the darkening highway, Marisol held the bag on her lap and thought about her grandmother. About the way Lola Caring used to press her palm flat against Marisol's cheek when she was small and say, "You have the kind of patience that God gives to people he trusts with hard things." She had thought it was comfort at the time. Now she wondered if it had been a warning. She would know what it is. She will know why. She did not know. Not yet. The apartment looked smaller when they returned, the way it always did after a few days away, the walls closer together, the ceiling lower, the yellow light over the kitchen sink more yellow. The girls went to bed with minimal protest, exhausted from the journey and the unfamiliar weight of adult sadness. Marisol sat at the kitchen table with the bread box in front of her and a pair of scissors and began to cut the electrical tape. It resisted. The layers were thick and the tape had dried into something almost solid, more casing than adhesive. She worked slowly, pulling the strips away in pieces, setting them on the table beside her. The box beneath was heavier than she had expected, which she registered with a brief narrowing of attention but did not allow herself to interpret. She was not someone who let herself hope before there was something to hope about. She had learned that lesson at considerable cost. The lid, when she finally freed the clasp, did not open easily. The rust along the hinge had fused the metal together over years of stillness, and she had to work a butter knife into the seam and press carefully, then more firmly, until she felt something give with a muted sound, like a small exhale. She opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old cheesecloth, was a bundle. She lifted it out and set it on the table and unwrapped it with the same careful steadiness she brought to everything. The cheesecloth came away in layers, dry and soft with age. What was inside stopped her hands completely. Coins. But not the coins one kept in a jar on the counter or sorted from sofa cushions on a desperate Tuesday. These were thick and golden and heavy, stacked in neat columns that had shifted slightly during transport. They gleamed under the kitchen light with the particular, quiet confidence of things that had always been worth something and knew it. Below the coins, wrapped separately in a piece of faded velvet, were several folded documents, brittle at the edges, covered in handwriting she recognized immediately as her grandmother's, the small, careful script of someone who had learned penmanship in a different era. She sat very still. She counted the coins slowly. There were 43 of them. She did not know what they were worth. She did not know, that night, that she was sitting in her small kitchen with her children asleep down the hall, looking at something that would take months to fully understand, something that would change everything, something that her grandmother had carried in silence for most of her life and chosen, in the end, to pass to the one granddaughter who had never stopped believing that patience was worth something. She knew only that the box was heavier than it looked. She knew only that her grandmother had told her she would understand. She wrapped the coins back in the cheesecloth and held the velvet parcel of documents in both hands and sat with it all for a long time while the refrigerator hummed and the street outside slowly went quiet. In the morning, she would begin to find out. The documents inside the velvet were 4 pages, written front and back in her grandmother's handwriting. The ink had faded to a pale brown in places, and some passages required her to angle them toward the window light to read. But the writing was legible, deliberate, the product of someone who had chosen their words carefully and taken their time. Marisol sat at the kitchen table before the girls woke, coffee cooling at her elbow, and read all of it twice. Her grandmother had written in the plain, direct voice she had used in all things. No elaborate preamble, no apology or excessive explanation. She began with a name, a man, a date, and a place, the way one begins a report rather than a letter. The man was Eduardo Reyes, Marisol's great-grandfather, a man she knew only as a face in a single framed photograph that had hung in Lola Caring's house as long as she could remember, dark-eyed, formal, occupying the photograph with the stiff self-consciousness of someone not accustomed to being photographed. According to the document, Eduardo Reyes had spent 11 years working as a laborer in a mining operation in the mountains of Benguet during the American colonial period. He had sent most of his wages home. He had also, Lola Caring wrote without further comment, been paid on certain occasions in gold rather than in paper money, because gold was more reliably valuable than any currency passing through uncertain hands in uncertain times. He had trusted no bank. He had trusted no one outside the family. He had kept what he accumulated in a tin bread box sealed with wire, later replaced with electrical tape when the wire grew sharp and difficult to manage, and he had given it to his wife when his health began to fail, and she had given it to her daughter, and her daughter had given it to Lola Caring, the youngest, the one considered least likely to spend it because she was known in the family for a certain unmovable stubbornness that everyone agreed was either a curse or a gift depending on the circumstances. Lola Caring had kept it for 60 years. She had never sold a single coin. She had added to it when she could, twice more, over the decades, when she came across coins she believed were valuable, purchasing them quietly from people who did not know what they had. She had kept it wrapped and sealed and behind the cooking oil and had told no one except her barangay captain witness and the vegetable seller, who she knew would not gossip because they were both women who understood the value of discretion. She had chosen Marisol because Marisol was the one who needed it most and the one most likely to be careful with it. Those were her words. Most likely to be careful. Not the smartest, not the most successful, not the one with the best prospects. The most careful. The one who understood that things worth having required patience and attention and a willingness to wait. She had written one more thing at the bottom of the last page, in smaller letters, as though adding it as an afterthought she had nevertheless saved for last. I do not know what they are worth now. I only know that gold does not lie, and that the people who laugh at what they do not understand will stop laughing eventually. See to it that your daughters are watching when they do. Marisol folded the documents and placed them back in the velvet and sat with her coffee until it was entirely cold. Then she took out her phone and began to search for what she had. She knew almost nothing about coins. She had grown up in a family that collected neither wealth nor hobbies, that operated from one month to the next with the focused practicality of people for whom there is no margin. What she knew about money was how quickly it disappeared and how slowly it returned. What she knew about value was that it was always assigned by someone with more power than you in a negotiation you had not been told was happening. But she was, as her grandmother had noted, careful. And careful people learn. She spent 3 evenings on her phone after the girls were in bed, reading everything she could find about Philippine colonial gold coins, about Spanish-era escudos, about American period coinage, about the difference between gold content and numismatic value. The word she had to look up before she could use it. She learned that age alone was not sufficient. That condition mattered enormously. That certain coins issued in limited quantities or during specific years commanded prices that seemed incomprehensible when written as numbers. She learned that there existed professionals called numismatists, whose entire purpose was the evaluation of precisely what she had, and that the reputable ones were careful and slow and did not make promises. She also learned, from a forum thread she read 3 times to be certain she understood it, that some collectors and dealers were not reputable, that people who did not know what they had were considered easy targets, and that the safest approach for someone in her position was to obtain multiple independent appraisals from verifiable sources before making any decision about selling or otherwise. She wrote this down in a notebook. She underlined it twice. She did not tell her brother or her sister about the coins. This was not a decision she made dramatically or with particular bitterness. It was simply practical. She had watched Dante's face during the will reading, the fraction of a second before the laugh where his expression had been something more complicated than amusement, something that looked almost like relief. He had expected nothing from the bread box. More importantly, he had wanted nothing from it to be valuable. Things that were valuable required decisions, discussions, challenges to the distribution that had already seemed satisfactory. Marisol's receiving something worthless was, from certain angles, quite convenient. She did not tell Rochelle either. Rochelle called twice in the 2 weeks after the funeral, and both times steered the conversation toward questions about how Marisol was managing, which was the kind of question that contained within it the assumption that managing was about all she could be expected to do. She did not tell anyone. She took a photograph of each coin individually, on a piece of white paper under the best light in the apartment, and she saved them all to a folder on her phone that she labeled grocery list in case anyone looked. Then she began the process of finding someone who could tell her what she actually had. The first numismatist she contacted was through an online listing, a shop downtown that advertised rare coin appraisals. She called during her lunch break and explained that she had inherited some old coins and would like to have them evaluated. The man who answered was polite but not particularly interested until she mentioned that some appeared to be gold and possibly from the Spanish colonial period, at which point his voice changed in a way she noted and did not entirely trust. She made an appointment for a Saturday, but she did not bring all the coins. She brought 3, selected carefully, 1 from each category she had tentatively identified, and she brought photographs of the rest. She also brought her notebook. She wore a plain face and unremarkable clothes and arrived 5 minutes late rather than 5 minutes early so that she would not seem eager. The shop was narrow and somewhat dim, the glass cases full of the organized accumulation of other people's inheritances. The man behind the counter was middle-aged and wore a loop around his neck and spoke to her with the patient condescension of someone who had dealt with many unknowing relatives bringing in grandparents' collections and expecting fortunes. He examined the 3 coins she laid before him with a small tool she had read about, tilted them toward the light, scratched a note on a pad. He offered her a price for the 3 coins. It was not nothing. It was more than her monthly rent. He said it with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to deliver modest numbers without visible emotion. She said she would think about it. She put the coins back in the cloth pouch she had brought and thanked him and left. She knew, because she had done her research, that the number he offered was low. Not insultingly so, not fraudulently so, but low in the way that first offers are always low, which is to say, low enough to leave room for the person making the offer to still profit substantially. She did not blame him for it. It was his business, but she was not going to accept it. She found a second appraiser through a reference in a collector's forum, a woman whose name appeared several times in discussions as someone fair, thorough, and not connected to any buying operation, meaning she evaluated for a flat fee rather than in anticipation of purchasing. This appraiser was based farther away and did not offer appointments quickly. Marisol waited 3 weeks and took a morning off work, losing 4 hours of pay she could not spare, and traveled to a small office above a bookshop in a quieter part of the city. This woman was different from the first in ways that Marisol found immediately reassuring. She asked more questions before she looked at anything. She asked how the coins had been stored, for how long, whether they had been cleaned or handled extensively, what the family knew of their origin. She listened with the specific attention of someone for whom the answer mattered not as background detail, but as data. Then she looked at the coins. All of them this time. Marisol had brought the whole collection, decided somewhere in the 3 weeks of waiting that the second appraiser had earned more trust than the first, and that trust, when it was warranted, was worth acting on. The woman worked for nearly 2 hours. She used a loop and a small scale and a reference catalog that she consulted several times with a focused expression. She photographed each coin with a proper camera and made notes in a system Marisol could not decipher, but which appeared precise. She did not speak much while she worked, and when she did it was to ask clarifying questions rather than to make observations. When she finished, she sat back and looked at Marisol. She told her that the collection was more significant than might be immediately obvious to a non-specialist, that it contained several pieces of genuine rarity, including 2 coins from a specific minting year during the Spanish period that were documented in the catalog as having extremely limited surviving examples in collectible condition. She mentioned the condition of these coins specifically, that they had been stored well, handled little, and showed minimal wear, a fact that elevated their value considerably. She explained the difference between spot gold value and numismatic premium in terms that were clear without being condescending, and she told Marisol that a full, formal appraisal document, the kind accepted by auction houses and reputable dealers, would take an additional 2 weeks and a fee she named up front. Marisol paid the fee. She did not have it immediately. She paid part of it and arranged to pay the remainder when the document was ready. The appraiser agreed without making her feel that this arrangement was unusual or inconvenient. On the bus ride home, Marisol kept the coin bag inside her jacket, pressed against her ribs, and looked out the window, and said nothing and thought about her grandmother wrapping and re-wrapping that tin box for 60 years, telling no one, and felt something move through her chest that she did not have a precise word for. It was not happiness. It was something older and quieter than happiness. It was the particular feeling of being seen by someone who is no longer there to see you. The 2 weeks passed in the ordinary way of weeks that contain something important at their end, which is to say they passed slowly and with a heightened awareness of ordinary things, the sounds the girls made in the morning, the quality of afternoon light through the kitchen window, the way rice smelled cooking. Marisol worked her shifts and picked up her daughters from school and paid what bills she could and deferred what she could not, and said nothing to anyone about what she was waiting for. Dante called once, asking if she was all right, which was how he opened conversations when he wanted something rather than when he was simply checking. She said she was fine. He said he was thinking of converting the room at the back of Lola Caring's house into a storage space. Asked if there was anything she wanted from there before he started clearing it out. She said she did not think so. He said okay, and they talked for 3 more minutes about nothing, and then both expressed mutual obligation to hang up. Rochelle sent a message with a photograph of a flower arrangement, some event she had attended, a celebration of something. Marisol replied with a heart emoji and went back to what she was doing. The formal appraisal document arrived, sent digitally to the email address she had provided, on a Tuesday morning while she was at work, and she read it for the first time in the small break room at the back of the shop where she worked, on her lunch break, sitting alone with her sandwich untouched because her hands were not quite steady enough to eat. The total appraisal value of the 43 coins, accounting for gold content assessed at current market rates and numismatic premiums applied individually to each piece based on rarity, condition, and historical documentation, was a number she had to read 3 times. Not because she doubted the document, but because numbers of that size did not match any category her life had previously offered her, and her mind kept sliding off the edges of it, the way a hand slips on a surface that is too smooth. The appraiser had attached a note at the bottom of the document. It said that several of the coins were of sufficient historical and numismatic significance that they would be of interest not only to private collectors, but potentially to institutional buyers, including museums and heritage foundations, some of which paid premiums above market rate for provably authenticated pieces with clear family histories. She had also noted, without pressure, that she could provide introductions to 3 auction houses that specialized in this category if Marisol wished to pursue that route, and that given the collection's composition, there was no urgency in selling, as its value was unlikely to decline. Marisol sat in the break room for the remainder of her lunch break and looked at the number on the screen and breathed very deliberately, in and out, the way she had taught herself to do in the years when panic was a constant visitor and deliberate breathing was the only thing she had that cost nothing. Then she picked up her sandwich and ate it. She had the rest of her shift to get through. The girls would need dinner. The world outside the appraisal document was still proceeding at its normal pace, and it required her participation. But something had changed in the break room that Tuesday afternoon, something she could feel clearly even if she could not yet name it precisely. The weight that had lived between her shoulder blades for so many years, that specific variety of heaviness that comes from not knowing how much further you can stretch before something tears, had shifted. Not lifted entirely, but shifted. She finished her shift. She picked up her daughters. She made rice, because it was what she had. She put the girls to bed and sat at the kitchen table with the tin bread box in front of her and the appraisal document open on her phone, and she thought about what came next. What came next required her to be careful, as careful as she had ever been in her life. She understood that what she now possessed was not simply money or the promise of money. It was information, and information in the wrong hands or at the wrong moment had a way of becoming someone else's leverage before you could close your fingers around it. She had watched enough of other people's luck turn into other people's opportunity to know that the distance between having something valuable and benefiting from it was not as short as it appeared. She also understood, because she had spent her whole adult life calculating the cost of small decisions against resources that could not absorb mistakes, that she could not afford to move quickly or carelessly. The appraisal was one step, a necessary and important step, but there were others ahead of it, each one requiring the same quality of attention her grandmother had paid to the box on the third shelf for 60 years. She was 34 years old, and she was starting over. She did not know it yet the way she would know it later, with the full weight of everything that followed. But something had been set in motion in the kitchen of a narrow apartment building on a quiet street in a city that had never once been particularly kind to her. Her grandmother had started a clock 60 years ago. It had been running all this time, ticking softly behind the cooking oil on a kitchen shelf, waiting for the right hands to open what had been kept. Those hands, it turned out, had been hers all along. The appraiser called her the following Thursday evening, while Marisol was supervising Clara's spelling homework. She stepped into the narrow hallway and kept her voice low. The appraiser said that she had, in the interest of professional thoroughness, cross-referenced 2 of the coins from the collection with an updated database maintained by a heritage organization in Manila. She said this without apology, explaining that this was standard practice for pieces of potential institutional significance, and that she hoped Marisol did not mind. Marisol said she did not mind. She pressed her back against the hallway wall and listened. One of the coins, the appraiser explained, a specific gold escudo that Marisol had photographed as number 7 in her grocery list folder, appeared to be one of only 4 confirmed surviving examples of a minting that had occurred during a particular 2-year window, details she specified with the calm precision of someone for whom these distinctions were the language of professional daily life. The 4th example, previously unaccounted for, had been noted in historical records as having passed into private hands in the early 20th century and subsequently lost to documented history. Its reappearance, authenticated and with a traceable family provenance, was, in the appraiser's measured phrase, of considerable interest to the heritage organization. She said that a representative from the organization had reached out to her, not having contacted Marisol directly out of respect for professional protocols, and asked whether the owner might be willing to discuss a potential acquisition, subject of course to the owner's preference. Marisol asked what that meant in practical terms. The appraiser said that it meant the organization was prepared to make an offer for that specific coin at a number above the numismatic appraisal value, potentially substantially above, because institutional acquisitions valued provenance and historical completeness in ways that private market transactions did not always account for. She said the number. It was, for a single coin, the equivalent of 6 years of Marisol's current salary. Marisol stood in her hallway with the sound of Clara asking from the other room whether privilege had 1 L or 2, and she said clearly and levelly into the phone, "I understand. Please let them know I'll be in touch." She went back into the kitchen and sat down across from her daughter and said it has 2, and pointed to the paper, and helped her write the rest of the word, and stayed with her until the homework was finished and the girls were both in bed. Then she sat alone and felt the things shifting again. That weight, that constant, grinding presence she had stopped noticing because it had been there so long it had come to feel like her natural posture. She thought about what Dante had said about the bread box on the day of the funeral. She had not heard his exact words in the moment, but she had replayed them since. The precise timbre of the laugh, the quick thing his face had done, the way Rochelle had pressed her lips together. She did not feel anger about this. She examined herself for anger, and found something quieter and more solid in its place. She felt confirmed. Not vindicated, not yet. That was a word for later, for when there was something specific to be vindicated against. For now, she simply felt that what had been seen clearly had been confirmed, and that was sufficient. She felt something else too, something she turned over carefully in the hallway dark before she went to bed. She felt the presence of her grandmother in the room, not supernaturally, not in any way she would have said out loud, but in the way that people who have loved you very specifically leave behind a kind of template, a feeling of being known. Lola Caring had known her, had known the kind of careful that she was, had known that the bread box would not be opened carelessly or spoken about prematurely or traded away to the first person who offered something for it, had known that she would sit in a break room and read a number 3 times and then eat her sandwich and go back to work, because that was the kind of person she was. The gift was not just the coins. The gift was the recognition. And that, Marisol thought in the hallway dark, was worth something that could not be appraised. She slept better that night than she had in years. Not because anything had been resolved, but because something had begun. There was a particular quality to those first weeks that Marisol would think about later, not with sentimentality, but with the focused attention she gave to things she wanted to understand accurately. The quality was suspension, the feeling of standing on a surface that had not yet decided whether it was solid. She went about her ordinary life with ordinary completeness, arriving on time, performing her work adequately, collecting her daughters, feeding them, listening to them, putting them to bed. She was present and functional in all the ways that mattered to the people around her. And beneath all of it, at a depth that she kept carefully sealed from the surface, something enormous was turning over slowly, like a stone in a current, finding its face. She had not yet told the appraiser whether she would pursue the institutional offer on the coin. She had said she would be in touch. That was true. She would. But she needed to understand several things first, and understanding things required time in the way that all real understanding did, the kind that could not be rushed without becoming something lesser, a performance of understanding rather than the thing itself. The first thing she needed to understand was legal. She had read enough in her initial research to know that the question of ownership in cases like hers was not as simple as the will had suggested. Inheritance in the Philippines was governed by law as well as by document, and while a handwritten notarized will was generally valid, the presence of multiple heirs and the possibility of disputes could complicate even clear language. She needed to know that what she had was unambiguously, legally, entirely hers before she did anything with it. She found a lawyer through the same forum where she had found the appraiser's name. A woman who specialized in estate and property law, whose profile described her as patient and precise, 2 qualities Marisol valued more than confidence or assertiveness. She called on a Wednesday evening and explained the situation in the same plain, factual terms she used for everything: the will, the distribution, the bread box, the coins. The lawyer listened and asked 3 specific questions about the will's witnesses and the absence of a notarial seal, and then told her that based on what she had described there was unlikely to be a successful legal challenge to her inheritance, but that a formal assessment of the document would be advisable before she took any significant financial step. The fee she quoted was manageable if Marisol paid it over 2 months. She made the appointment for the following Saturday. The lawyer's office was clean and small and smelled of coffee and the particular kind of neutral air that professional spaces developed over years of hosting people in various states of crisis. The lawyer was younger than Marisol had expected, with the careful, measuring expression of someone who had heard many stories and was skilled at identifying the parts that mattered. She reviewed the documents Marisol brought, the photographs of the will, the appraisal, the appraiser's formal letter. She made notes. She asked several questions that Marisol had not anticipated, about the witnesses, about whether any other family member had claimed a share of the contents of the house before the will's items were distributed, about whether Dante had yet begun any formal transfer of the property. Marisol answered everything as accurately as she could. The lawyer said that the will was likely valid, but that she would recommend one additional step before the institutional offer was accepted. A formal probate filing, even an informal one, would create a legal record of Marisol's ownership of the bread box and its contents that could not later be challenged. This was particularly important, she explained, if the coins were going to be sold for significant amounts of money, because significant amounts of money had a way of reviving dormant familial objections. She was not wrong. Marisol had thought about Dante and Rochelle. She had done so with the honest clarity she brought to all difficult things, examining her own motivations for secrecy with the same rigor she applied to everything else. She did not think she was being unfair. The will had been unambiguous. The box had been designated for her by name, with the specific intention of Lola Caring clearly expressed. No other sibling had been given the box. No other sibling had been told, as far as she knew, that it contained anything of value. Whatever the coins were worth, they were hers by the explicit wish of the person who had kept them. But she also knew that significant amounts of money had a way of rewriting memories. Dante would not necessarily remember his laugh at the funeral the way she did. He would remember, when told of the coin's value, that he had not been given adequate information at the time of the will reading. He would remember that their grandmother had not been entirely clear, that the old woman had perhaps been confused toward the end, that a fair distribution would have included consultation with all of the grandchildren. He would not remember any of this consciously as invention. He would simply remember it, the way people remembered the versions of events that served them best. She was not angry at him for this. She was practical about it. She took the lawyer's advice and began the probate filing and paid the associated fees over the month that followed in amounts that required her to skip one electricity payment and negotiate a brief delay with her landlord, who had known her for 4 years and agreed, without making it a problem. While the filing was in progress, she continued her research. She had been corresponding, through the appraiser, with the representative from the Heritage Organization, a man whose emails were formal and careful and whose offers, she had begun to understand, came from an institution with deep pockets and a genuine interest in the material. He had sent her additional documentation about the specific coin she possessed, its historical context, the archive records that confirmed only 3 previous examples had been authenticated. He had sent her images of the other 3, displayed in museum collections in Seville and Mexico City and Manila. Looking at those photographs, Marisol had felt something she had not expected. Not triumph. Something more complicated. The feeling of her great-grandfather's hands moving through the same air as those images. The feeling of a man who had worked in a mountain for 11 years passing something forward through time without knowing what it would become. Eduardo Reyes had not known what he had. He had known gold was worth keeping. He had known that banks were not to be trusted in uncertain times. He had known that his family would need something he could not give them directly, because the future was always arriving in shapes that the present could not predict. He had sealed a tin box and given it to his wife, and she had given it onward and onward until it reached a 34-year-old woman in a small apartment who counted bus fare in her palm and chose rice over beans and put her daughters to bed each night under a ceiling that was lower than it should have been. He could not have predicted her, but he had prepared for her anyway. She thought about this in the evenings, after the girls were asleep, with the tin bread box on the table in front of her. She had stopped keeping the coins inside it once the appraisal was complete, had moved them to a more secure location that the appraiser had recommended, a licensed facility with proper insurance and environmental controls. But she kept the box. She kept it on the table. She kept it because it was the container of something more than the coins. It was the container of every pair of hands that had passed it forward, every decade of silence, every decision made by women who understood that some things were worth more than their apparent surface. The probate filing was finalized in the 6th week. The lawyer called on a Tuesday morning, the same day of the week the appraisal had arrived, and Marisol noted this without assigning it significance but felt the alignment of it nonetheless. The document was formal and clear. The tin bread box and all its contents, as described in the last will and testament of Carolina Reyes, were legally the property of Marisol Reyes, daughter of her son Rodrigo Reyes, free from any claim or encumbrance. She sat at the kitchen table and read the document 3 times. Then she called the appraiser and asked her to arrange a meeting with the Heritage Organization's representative. The meeting took place at the appraiser's office, which Marisol had come to think of as neutral ground, neither her own uncertain territory nor the institution's imposing one. The representative was a tall man in his 50s who wore the careful, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to negotiating with people who had things he wanted and who understood that patience on his part was a professional tool as much as a personal quality. He brought documentation of his own, the institution's authentication protocols, comparable acquisition records with identifying details removed, a written statement of the offer that differed by a small but meaningful amount from what had been communicated in earlier correspondence. Marisol had prepared. She had read about auction house valuations for comparable pieces. She had corresponded, briefly and carefully, with a collector in Hong Kong whose name had appeared in the forum she trusted, who had given her, without any obligation or expectation, a ballpark sense of what the coin might fetch at open auction. That number was higher than what the Heritage Organization was offering. She did not say this immediately. She let the representative present his offer. She listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions about authentication timelines, about public attribution, and about whether the institution had a stated position on repatriation and provenance. The last question was not strategic. She genuinely wanted to know. He answered all 3 questions. The answer to the third was careful and institutional in its phrasing, but contained within it a genuine awareness of the political and moral landscape that the acquisition of colonial-era artifacts from descendants of the colonized occupied in the current moment. He was not naive about it. He had been doing this long enough to understand what he was asking her to part with. She told him that she appreciated the offer, but that she needed additional time to consider. She told him she was looking at an auction alternative and that she believed, based on her research, that a public sale might generate a higher final number. She told him this without apology or theater, the way she told her daughters things that were true and needed to be said plainly. He asked if she was open to a counter. She said she was always open to information. He made a number that was higher than the first by an amount that represented a meaningful difference, not a token one. He explained that the institution valued the directness of a private acquisition over the uncertainty of auction, and that this value was reflected in what they were willing to pay above market expectations. She said she would be in touch within 2 weeks. The meeting ended. The appraiser walked her to the door and said nothing beyond ordinary pleasantries. But her expression when she said goodbye was the expression of someone who had watched things go better than expected and was genuinely pleased about it. On the bus home, Marisol sat with her hands in her lap and looked at her own reflection in the dark window of the tunnel section of the route and thought about her grandmother's handwriting. Small and careful and precise. The handwriting of someone who believed that words, set down with intention, carried weight beyond the moment of their writing. I do not know what they are worth now. I only know that gold does not lie. Gold did not lie. Neither, Marisol was beginning to understand, did patience. Nor did the specific kind of careful that had been named as her primary quality by the person who had known her best and longest and chosen her, above all others, to carry something forward. She got off the bus and walked the 6 blocks home and climbed the stairs and let herself into the apartment and stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment before she turned the light on. The tin bread box sat on the table, dull and grimy and entirely ordinary to look at. She put her hand on it and left it there for a moment. Then she started dinner. The 2 weeks she had given herself did not pass idly. Marisol was not built for idleness, had never been, and the particular urgency of her current situation sharpened her natural tendency toward methodical action into something closer to precision. She had a decision to make, and she was going to make it correctly, which meant she was going to make it with as much information as she could reasonably gather in the time available to her. She spent the first 4 days examining the auction route with the same thoroughness she had brought to her initial coin research. She identified 3 auction houses with established track records in numismatic and historical collections, read the fine print on their commission structures, their reserve price policies, their authentication requirements, and their estimated timelines from consignment to final sale. She found that the process was longer than she had initially understood, typically 4 to 6 months from submission to hammer, and that the outcome was genuinely uncertain in a way that institutional offers were not. Auction prices for rare pieces could exceed estimates dramatically. They could also fall short. The uncertainty ran in both directions. She was not averse to uncertainty as a philosophical matter. She had lived inside it for years. But she understood the difference between the uncertainty of not knowing whether there would be enough money for groceries and the uncertainty of not knowing whether a coin would sell for more or less than expected. The first kind was dangerous. The second kind was, for someone in her position, a luxury. She had 2 daughters. She had a lease that required monthly attention. She had debts that were not catastrophic but were persistent. The institutional offer, at the number the representative had eventually presented, was not the maximum she might achieve. But it was certain, immediate upon completion of the sale, and sufficient to change the material conditions of her life, not incrementally, but fundamentally. She called the appraiser on the 5th day and asked her to inform the representative that she was prepared to accept the revised offer, subject to the condition that the authentication process be completed within a defined window, and that the attribution of the coin in any public display include the name Eduardo Reyes and the Reyes family provenance. These were her terms. She had thought about them carefully. The money mattered. The name mattered too. The representative came back within a day. He accepted both conditions without revision. She signed the agreement the following week, in the appraiser's office again, on a Tuesday, which had apparently become her day. The appraiser witnessed it. The representative produced a bank draft for the deposit, the remainder to be transferred upon completion of authentication, which was scheduled for 30 days out. Marisol took the bank draft home in her jacket pocket and did not look at it on the bus. She had decided that looking at it on the bus was not something she was going to do. She waited until the girls were in bed. Then she sat at the kitchen table with the tin bread box and the bank draft and looked at the number on the draft for a long time. It was a deposit, a fraction of the total, and it was more money than she had seen in any form, in any account, in her entire life. She did not cry. She did something more difficult, which was to feel it fully and clearly, and without either minimizing or expanding it into something it was not. It was not magic. It was not a resolution of everything. It was a number on a piece of paper that represented a beginning, and beginnings, she had learned at considerable cost, were only valuable if you treated them as exactly that and not as endings. She put the draft in the small fireproof box she had bought secondhand from a closing office sale 3 years ago, the one she kept at the back of the wardrobe with her insurance documents and the girls' birth certificates. She put the lid on the tin bread box and placed it on the shelf above the fireproof box, where she could see it when she opened the wardrobe. Then she went to bed. In the morning, she made the girls breakfast and braided Clara's hair and signed Jasmine's permission form for the school trip and walked them both to the school gate and came home and sat at the table with her coffee and began the next list. Because there was always a next list. The money, when it arrived in full, would need to be managed with the same quality of attention she had given to getting it. She knew nothing about managing money at scale. She knew a great deal about managing the absence of money. These were not the same skill. She found a financial advisor through a process that took another 2 weeks. She was specific about what she was looking for. Someone who worked with clients at the beginning of their financial lives rather than those already established. Someone whose fee structure was transparent and fixed rather than commission-based. Someone who would explain things in plain language without condescension. She interviewed 3 candidates. She chose the one who asked the most questions and answered her questions with the least performance of expertise. She told him the full picture. The coins, the sale, the expected total, the debt she was carrying, the rent, the girls, the fact that she had never in her life held more than 1 month's salary in reserve. He listened to all of it and made notes, and then said that before they talked about investment strategy or savings or any of the things that the word financial advisor typically implied, they should talk about stability, which was a different thing. He said that stability and wealth were frequently confused but almost never the same, and that for someone in her specific position, stability was the more urgent priority and the one that would make everything else possible. She agreed with this. It was what she had been thinking without having the language for it. They made a plan. It was not complicated. It was, in fact, deliberately simple, and she recognized the deliberateness of that simplicity as a form of respect. Clear debts. Establish a reserve. Secure the children's education costs. Then, once those 3 foundations were in place, consider the slower questions of longer-term growth. He also mentioned, without pressure but with consistent emphasis, the importance of taking care of herself in practical terms. Things she had been postponing for years, medical appointments, dental care for her and the girls, the replacement of items in the apartment that had been broken or inadequate for longer than she liked to count. These were not luxuries, he said. They were maintenance, and unmaintained things cost more to repair than to keep. She wrote all of this down. She left the meeting feeling something unfamiliar, the particular sensation of having a plan that was not simply a survival strategy, but an actual architecture, a structure with rooms in it rather than just walls. She had not told Dante or Rochelle anything yet. She had been waiting, not out of desire for drama, but out of the practical understanding that people who knew you had something valuable would offer advice you had not asked for, and that advice in those circumstances was rarely disinterested. She wanted the process far enough along that advice was no longer relevant before she said anything. The authentication took 28 days. The heritage organization's authenticators were thorough and careful, which she had expected and which confirmed her confidence in the institution. They corresponded with her twice during the process with procedural updates, professional and courteous. On the 28th day, the appraiser called to tell her that authentication had been successfully completed and that the transfer of funds would process within 5 business days. It processed in 4. She was at work when her phone showed the notification from the bank. She was in the middle of a task that required her full attention, and she completed it before she looked at her phone properly. When she did look at it, standing in the same small break room where she had read the appraisal document weeks earlier, she saw the number in her account and stood very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went back to work and finished her shift. That evening, after dinner, she sat the girls down at the kitchen table and told them that something had happened because of what Lola Caring had left her, and that their lives were going to change in some ways, and that she wanted them to understand what the change was and where it had come from. Jasmine, who was 9 and already possessed of the kind of watchful intelligence that noticed things before they were announced, had been watching her mother for weeks with an expression of careful patience. When Marisol finished explaining, she said, "Did Lola Caring know it was worth that much?" Marisol thought about this honestly. She said, "I think she knew it was worth something. I'm not sure she knew exactly how much, but she knew enough to keep it safe and to make sure it went to the right person." Jasmine said, "And she thought that was you?" Marisol said yes. Jasmine nodded as though this confirmed something she had already decided. Clara, who was 6 and had been listening with the focused incomprehension of someone following a story in a language they mostly, but not entirely understood, asked if this meant they could get a dog. Marisol laughed. It was the first real laugh she had produced in a long time, not the social laugh she deployed for coworkers or the gentle laugh she gave her daughters when they needed encouragement, but the involuntary, unguarded kind that arrived without permission. She laughed, and both girls looked at her with the particular delight of children who have produced an effect they did not entirely predict. And then Clara laughed too, because her mother was laughing, and Jasmine smiled the small private smile she reserved for moments she was filing away for later. Marisol said they would talk about the dog. She called her Aunt Celia the next morning. Not Dante, not Rochelle. Celia, who had known the shape of Marisol's life without embellishment and had always spoken to her with the particular honesty of someone who respected her enough not to soften things unnecessarily. She told Celia what had happened. All of it. The coins, the appraiser, the heritage organization, the sale. Celia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother told me once, years ago, that she was keeping something for the right person and that she would know when she found them. She said she looked at all her grandchildren, and she waited, and she said that the one she was looking for was the one who never asked for things, but never stopped working either. She said, that one will know what to do." Marisol held the phone and did not say anything for a moment. Celia said, "She chose correctly." Marisol said, "I know." After she hung up with Celia, she sat with the knowledge for a while before she called Dante. He picked up on the second ring, which was how he always answered calls, as if he had been expecting them. She told him that she needed to share some information about what Lola Caring had left her, and he said sure, of course, with the distracted ease of someone who had already decided the information would be unremarkable. She told him. The silence on his end of the line was different from Celia's silence. Celia's had been warm, absorptive. Dante's was the silence of a man recalibrating, of someone whose internal categories were being reorganized without his consent. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, behind the breathing, the precise moment when something shifted in his understanding of the situation. He said, "From the bread box." She said yes. He said, "The tin box. The one that was in the kitchen." She said yes. "Behind the cooking oil." He said, "Marisol, I had no idea. None of us knew there was anything valuable in there." She said she understood that. He said, "That's incredible. That's extraordinary." He sounded like he was choosing his words carefully, which was not his usual mode. He said, "If we had known, obviously the situation would have been different." She said she wasn't sure what he meant by that. He said, "I just mean, in terms of the distribution. Lola probably would have wanted all of us to benefit. As a family." She let a brief pause exist before she spoke. She said that Lola Caring had written 4 pages of explanation for why she had made the choice she made, and that the explanation was clear, and that the legal documentation had been filed and finalized. She said she was sharing this information with him because he was her brother, and she believed in being straightforward, not because the situation was open to renegotiation. He said, "No, of course. I'm not saying that. I'm just processing." She said she understood. She asked about his sons, about his wife, about the renovation he was planning for the house on Sampaguita Street. He answered these questions, and she answered his questions about the girls, and they talked for another few minutes, and then said goodbye. She called Rochelle after. That conversation was shorter. Rochelle had a different quality of response, less recalibration and more something that sounded almost like embarrassment, as though she were remembering the "you look tired" and the pressed lips and finding them currently inconvenient. She said that was amazing and that Marisol deserved it, and that she was so happy for her, all of which were true enough statements arranged in an order that allowed Rochelle to arrive quickly at the part of the conversation where she could feel good about herself again. Marisol accepted this graciously and without irony. She did not need Rochelle to be uncomfortable. She needed only to have made the call. She called neither of them again for several weeks. Not out of coldness, simply because she had things to do that required her full attention, and her full attention was a finite resource she had learned not to distribute beyond its capacity. The first week after the transfer, she did 3 things. She paid off the remaining credit card debt, which had been accumulating for 4 years with the slow relentlessness of a tide. She paid 6 months of rent in advance, which produced in her landlord a visible confusion he managed politely, and which produced in her the specific sensation of breathing with her full lung capacity for the first time in a very long time. And she made 4 medical appointments, 1 for herself, 1 for each of the girls, and 1 for the dental clinic that had been sending her gentle reminder messages for 2 years. These were not glamorous things. No one would make a story out of them. But they were. She understood with the clarity of someone who had spent years in their absence, the infrastructure of a life that was actually held together rather than simply held in place by willpower and calculation. In the second week, she began looking at schools. This was a decision she had made quietly, without drama, in the same break room where she had received both revelations, the appraisal and the transfer. She had decided that the single most important thing she could do for Jasmine and Clara, beyond the immediate stability, was education of a quality that had not previously been within her reach to provide. Not because their current school was failing them. It was not. It was adequate in the way that adequate things were adequate, sufficient, and unglamorous. But she knew what a different kind of education could offer, had known it in the abstract for years without being able to do anything with the knowledge, and now the knowledge had become actionable. She visited 4 schools over the course of 2 weekends. She took Jasmine with her and left Clara with the neighbor whose son still occasionally fell asleep on the couch. She walked through the hallways with Jasmine beside her and watched her daughter's eyes and paid attention to what they stopped on. Jasmine noticed things other people's children might have walked past: the library's organization system, the view from one particular window, the quality of the light in a science room, the way a teacher spoke to a student in passing in a hallway. Jasmine noticed. Jasmine was 9 years old and already noticing the difference between places that took their students seriously and places that considered their students a contained situation. She chose the school that Jasmine's eyes stayed widest in. It was not the most expensive of the 4. It was the one where the attention in the building felt directed toward the children rather than at the idea of the children. Clara's situation was different because Clara was 6 and did not yet have the vocabulary for her own preferences, but had very strong feelings about colors and whether a room felt like somewhere you could make a mess in if you needed to. The school Marisol chose for her was bright and a little loud and smelled of paint, which Clara declared, at the end of the visit, to be the best smell she had ever encountered. Enrollment for both was arranged. The paperwork was substantial and the financial commitment was real, and Marisol signed everything without uncertainty because she had checked 3 times that the numbers were within the plan she had made with the financial advisor, and they were, comfortably, within the plan. She was several weeks into this new phase of things when she first began to feel the other shift, the one that had nothing to do with money or schools or medical appointments. It was subtler than any of those, and it arrived not in a moment, but over a period of days, and it was the shift in how she existed in her own life. She had been, for so long, a woman managing an emergency. Not one emergency with a beginning and an end, but the sustained low-level emergency of not enough, of constant calculation, of the particular vigilance required to keep two children safe and fed and loved in circumstances that required all three of those things to be maintained entirely by the same person with the same finite energy. She had been good at it. She had been, in fact, extraordinary at it. But she had never known, because there had been nothing to compare it against, how much of her she had been devoting to it. Now, with the immediate pressure removed, she began to discover what was left when the emergency receded. There was more of her than she had remembered. She had opinions about things she had not allowed herself to have opinions about, because opinions required a stability of mind that constant calculation consumed. She found herself reading again, which she had stopped doing years ago because reading required a quality of attention she could not spare. She found herself looking at things, not just noting them as either threats or resources, but actually looking at them, the way Jasmine looked at buildings, with the focused curiosity of someone who found the world legitimately interesting. She found herself thinking about her grandmother in new ways, not just in the context of the coins or the choice or the letter, but in the context of a woman's whole life. Lola Caring had been born into very little and had survived a war and raised children in the rebuilding years after it and grown old in a world that had changed around her in ways she had observed without being consumed by them. She had kept a tin box on a shelf for 60 years. She had trusted a granddaughter she believed in. She had written, in her careful handwriting, that she did not know what the coins were worth, but she knew gold did not lie. Marisol thought about what it meant to live a life that left something behind. Not a legacy in the large, formal sense, but something specific, tangible, chosen. Something wrapped in cheesecloth and velvet and passed forward with intention. She thought about what she wanted to leave behind for Jasmine and Clara. Not necessarily money, though money was real and necessary, and she no longer had any patience for the version of wisdom that pretended otherwise. But something beneath the money. Some quality. Some way of being in the world that would serve them when the world was difficult. And it would be difficult. It was always difficult. That was not pessimism. That was honesty. She thought she wanted to leave them the knowledge that careful was a strength. That patience was not the same as passivity. That the thing everyone dismissed was sometimes the thing worth keeping. She also thought she wanted to leave them a dog, but that was a separate matter. She mentioned the dog seriously to Jasmine one evening, sitting at the table after dinner, which was now sometimes a different dinner from before, not extravagant, but varied, the small change of being able to choose without calculating. Jasmine said she thought a medium-sized dog would be appropriate given the size of the apartment, and that they should probably wait until they moved somewhere larger, which they were apparently going to do. She said this with the neutral certainty of someone who had decided it had already been decided. Marisol asked when she had decided that. Jasmine said she had decided it the night Marisol had explained about the coins, when Marisol had laughed the real laugh. She said it was the first time she had heard that laugh and she couldn't remember how long, and she had decided that whatever produced that laugh was worth following. Marisol looked at her daughter across the table for a long moment. She said, "You're 9 years old." Jasmine said she was aware. Marisol said, "Your great-great-grandfather would have liked you very much." Jasmine asked who that was. So Marisol told her about Eduardo Reyes, about the mountains of Benguet and the 11 years in the mines, and the gold paid, instead of paper money, and the tin box sealed with wire that became sealed with electrical tape over the decades that it traveled from hand to hand down through the family. She told her about Lola Caring keeping it for 60 years behind the cooking oil on the third shelf, telling no one, waiting for the right person. She told her the sentence, the one at the bottom of the last page, in smaller letters as though added as an afterthought, saved for last. "I do not know what they are worth now. I only know that gold does not lie, and that the people who laugh at what they do not understand will stop laughing eventually. See to it that your daughters are watching when they do." Jasmine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So we were the daughters." Marisol said yes. Jasmine thought about this. Then she said, "Were the people watching?" Marisol thought about Dante's voice on the phone, the recalibrating silence. She thought about Rochelle and the embarrassment moving through the phone line like a current. She thought about the cousins who had exchanged glances, the one who had said a bread box just loudly enough to be heard. She said, "They're starting to." Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its ordinary evening things, its traffic and its light, and its accumulated noise of people managing their own versions of everything. The tin bread box sat on the shelf above the wardrobe in the room down the hall, where Marisol had moved it after the fireproof box took its place in the daily geography of importance. It was still dull and grimy and visually unremarkable. She had not cleaned it. She did not intend to. It looked exactly like what it was, an old tin box that had spent decades in a kitchen, sealed with layers of electrical tape, passed from hand to hand by people who understood that some things were worth more than they appeared. Jasmine asked if they could see it. Marisol got up and brought it to the table and set it between them. Clara, who had been drawing at the end of the table with the focused single-mindedness of a 6-year-old mid-project, looked up and looked at it and said it was ugly. Marisol said yes. That was rather the point. Clara went back to her drawing. Jasmine put both hands on the box, the way you put your hands on something you wanted to take the measure of, and sat with it for a moment. Then she looked up at her mother and said, "Can I keep it when I grow up?" Marisol said yes. She said, "Yes, that is exactly what happens with this box. The right person keeps it." Jasmine nodded. She took her hands off the box with the careful deliberateness of someone making a commitment. She was 9 years old, and she already knew how to make commitments. Her mother had taught her that without meaning to, by demonstrating, over years and years of hard mornings and calculated evenings and real laughs that arrived without warning, what it looked like to carry something forward without setting it down. The authentication certificate for the coin arrived by courier 3 days after the funds transferred. It was a substantial document, dense with technical language and institutional stamps, but its essence was simple. This is what it is. This is who it belonged to. This is where it came from. The Heritage Organization had honored the attribution condition without modification. In the provenance section, in clean type, it read, "Originally in the possession of Eduardo Reyes, laborer, Benguet Province, Philippine Islands, circa early 20th century. Transmitted through the Reyes family across 4 generations to Marisol Reyes, Manila, present day." She had it framed. Not the whole document, which was too technical to display meaningfully, but the provenance section, printed separately on good paper, in a simple frame she bought from a shop near the girls' new school. She hung it in the kitchen, where she could see it from the table. Eduardo Reyes, Benguet Province. For generations. Present day. This was what persisted. Not the coin itself, which now lived in a museum vitrine in a climate-controlled room in Manila, labeled and documented, and available to anyone who came to look at it. Not the money, which was real and necessary and working quietly in the architecture that had been built for it. What persisted was the name. The proof that he had existed, had worked, had thought forward into a future he could not see, had trusted gold over paper because he understood that some things held their value across time without requiring anyone's permission. Marisol sat at the kitchen table in the mornings with her coffee and looked at the frame and thought about chains of trust, about the series of women who had held the box and kept the silence and passed it on, about herself at the end of that chain, the one who had been chosen not for her success or her resources, but for her carefulness, her willingness to wait, her resistance to the kind of hope that burned fast and left nothing. She thought about the laugh in the funeral room. She thought about a bread box. She thought about a bread box. Gold did not lie. The people who had laughed were not yet done understanding how true that was. That understanding was coming. It was, like most things worth waiting for, arriving on its own schedule, in its own way, at exactly the right time. She sipped her coffee. She looked at the frame. She waited for part 3, which was already beginning. There was a period, roughly 3 months after the transfer, that Marisol thought of privately as the settling. Not settling in the sense of accepting less than she deserved, which was a thing she had done for years without recognition and was now finished with. Settling in the sense that things were finding their level, like water in a new container. She had poured something enormous into a life that had been shaped for scarcity, and she was watching, with interested attention, as the shape of the life adjusted. Some adjustments were practical and immediate. The apartment, which she had extended the lease on by 6 months while she looked for something else, was adequate in the short term but not appropriate as a long-term situation. She spent several weeks looking, with the same patient methodical approach she brought to everything, at flats and houses in different parts of the city. She was specific about what she needed. Not large, not ostentatious, not anything that required more maintenance than 2 adults, which was to say herself and Jasmine, who had recently demonstrated a strong personal investment in the domestic ecosystem and had opinions about floor plans. She needed a second bedroom for each of the girls. She needed a kitchen table large enough to work at. She needed a garden or at minimum a balcony, because Clara had shifted from wanting a dog to wanting a garden, and Marisol was not going to deny her either if she could help it. She found the flat in the 4th week of looking. It was on the 3rd floor of a building that was 12 years old and well-maintained, in a neighborhood that was neither wealthy nor struggling, which was precisely the quality she was looking for. It had 3 bedrooms and a long balcony facing east, which meant morning light fell across the kitchen table at the hour when she most used it. It had been repainted recently and smelled of the kind of neutral new that made a space feel like a beginning. She moved in on a Saturday with the help of 2 men from a moving service and Aunt Celia, who arrived with food and opinions about box placement and was invaluable on both counts. The girls were present for the entire process, Jasmine directing where things should go with the authority of someone who had been waiting to exercise it, and Clara running from room to room in the empty flat before the furniture arrived, calling out the name of each room as she claimed it. When the last box was in and Celia had gone home with the containers the food had come in, Marisol stood in the kitchen alone for a moment and looked at the east-facing window and the table she had positioned beneath it. Then she went to the box labeled Kitchen Essentials and unwrapped the frame with Eduardo Reyes in it and hung it on the wall where she had already measured and marked the nail. The tin bread box she placed on the kitchen shelf. 3rd shelf, not behind the cooking oil this time, because she did not see the point in hiding it any further. It had been hidden long enough. The girls started at their new schools on the same Monday. Marisol dropped Clara first, at the bright, loud, paint-smelling school, and watched her walk through the gate without looking back, which was exactly how Clara moved through the world, forward and without excessive ceremony. Then she walked with Jasmine to the school where the library was organized in the way Jasmine had noticed, and the light came through the science room windows at a particular angle. At the gate, Jasmine stopped and looked at her mother with the focused, serious expression she wore when she wanted to say something she had been thinking about for a while. She said, "I know it's going to be different from my old school." Marisol said yes, it would be. Jasmine said, "I'm not scared of different." Marisol said she knew. Jasmine said, "Lola Caring would have liked to see this, wouldn't she?" Marisol said yes. She would have liked it very much. Jasmine nodded once, with finality, and went through the gate. Marisol walked home alone through the streets of the new neighborhood, which were unfamiliar in the productive way that new things were unfamiliar, not threatening, but requiring attention. She stopped at a small cafe she had noticed during the move and sat at a table by the window and ordered a coffee and did not do anything for 20 minutes except drink the coffee and look out the window. This too was new. The capacity to do nothing for 20 minutes without calculating what it was costing. She had not known how to do nothing for a long time. She was relearning it the way you relearned something your body had once known and then forgotten under pressure, gradually, with occasional clumsiness, with the particular pleasure of recognition. The weeks that followed were, in the external sense, quieter than the months before them. The dramatic architecture of the thing, the appraisal, the negotiations, the sale, the legal process, the transfer, had resolved itself into the slower work of building. There was no single moment of arrival, because arriving at a different kind of life was not a moment. It was a continuous process of making choices that were different from the choices you had made before and recognizing, each time, that you were allowed to make them. She made an appointment for herself with a doctor she had chosen rather than been assigned to, which was a distinction she had never previously had the luxury of drawing. The doctor spent 45 minutes with her, which was 40 more than she had been accustomed to, and at the end told her that she was, considering the years she had described, in reasonable health, and recommended several things that required follow-up appointments, none of them urgent, all of them overdue. Marisol scheduled all the follow-ups before she left the building. She bought books. This was a small thing that felt significant. She bought them from a bookshop near the new flat and carried them home in a bag and put them on the shelf she had designated for this purpose. And in the evenings after the girls were in bed, she read with the particular absorption of someone whose attention had been returned to them after a long absence. She called Celia regularly, more regularly than she had in years. Their conversations were unhurried in a way that previous calls had not been, because previous calls had always been made from the middle of something urgent, and she had always been keeping one part of her mind on the next task while talking. Now she was just talking. It was, she found, a better way to talk. She did not call Dante or Rochelle often. When she did, the conversations were pleasant enough, in the particular way of conversations that have been permanently altered by a shift in the underlying circumstances. Dante had apparently processed what had happened and arrived at a position of genuine warmth about it, or something that presented as genuine warmth, which was perhaps the same thing. He asked about the girls, about the new flat, about whether she had made any decisions about longer-term investments, this last question carrying within it the faint implication that he had thoughts about this, which she did not invite. Rochelle sent photographs of the condo renovation and asked how Marisol was, and Marisol said she was well, and asked about Rochelle's boyfriend, and Rochelle said things were moving in a good direction, hinting at an engagement without stating it, which was also a Rochelle mode of communication she recognized. She said she was happy for her and meant it. It was Celia who brought the thing into language that Marisol had been circling without finding the right words for. They were on the phone one evening, a Thursday, the girls in bed, Marisol at the kitchen table with the frame on the wall and the tin box on the shelf, and Celia said, "Your grandmother used to say that the life you deserve and the life you have are rarely the same life, and that the distance between them is mostly made of other people's opinions." Marisol asked what she meant by that. Celia said that Lola Caring had believed that people who were struggling were very often not struggling because they lacked ability or intelligence or even effort. They were struggling because they had inherited other people's stories about what was possible for them, and that the only way out of someone else's story was to find the thread of your own and pull it. Marisol said, "And she thought the bread box was my thread." Celia said, "I think she thought you were already pulling it. The bread box was just the part she could give you." Marisol held the phone and looked at the frame. Eduardo Reyes, Benguet province. For generations. She said, she was right about the careful thing. Celia said yes, she was right about that. They talked for another hour, about ordinary things, about Celia's garden and the neighbor who played music too loud and the mango tree that had produced an astonishing number of fruit this year, and Marisol felt, throughout all of it, the particular warmth of being known by someone who had known you long enough to hold both the before and the after in the same regard. The after was still being written. That was perhaps the most important thing she understood now, standing in the kitchen she had chosen, in the flat she had chosen, with the school chosen and the doctor seen and the plan made and the frame on the wall and the box on the shelf. It was still being written, not by the coin or by the money or by the choices of a man who had worked in a mountain 100 years ago. By her, one decision at a time, one morning at a time, with the same careful attention she had always brought to everything, but now with the additional quality of belief, the deep, structural belief that the effort was for something that could actually be reached. Her grandmother had waited 60 years for the right person to open the box. Marisol intended to make that wait worth something for a long time to come. She set the phone on the table and sat with the quiet kitchen and the east-facing window now dark with night, and the shelf where the tin box sat, dull and unbeautiful and entirely without glamour, looking exactly like nothing, the way it had always looked, the way things worth everything so frequently did. She reached up and touched it once, briefly, with the flat of her hand. Then she turned off the light and went to bed. Tomorrow the girls would need breakfast, and the coffee would need making, and the day would arrange itself in the ordinary way of days that contained within them, beneath their surface, the steady forward motion of a life that had finally found its footing. She slept well. She had been sleeping well for weeks. It was, she had decided, one of the better changes. There was a woman who worked at the coffee shop near the new flat whose name was Belen, and who had been making Marisol's morning coffee for 8 weeks, and who one morning, without particular preamble, said that she noticed Marisol came in on the days she was not in a hurry and sat by the window and did not look at her phone, and that she thought this was an unusual quality in a person. Marisol said she was working on relearning something she had forgotten how to do. Belen said that sounded like it had a longer story behind it. Marisol said it did. She did not tell Belen the long story that morning. But she returned the following week, and the week after, and in the gradual accumulation of mornings, a friendship developed of the sort that adult women develop when they are not performing it, when they simply keep being in the same place with an increasingly comfortable quality of attention. She told Belen some of the story eventually, not all of it, not yet, perhaps not ever in its entirety, because some stories were for keeping and some were for telling, and wisdom was knowing which was which. What she told her was the essential shape of it. A grandmother. A tin box. A thing kept for 60 years. A woman who needed it. Belen said, "Your grandmother sounds like someone who understood things at a different speed than other people." Marisol said yes, she thought that was it exactly. Belen said, "My grandmother was like that too. She had this way of seeing what was going to matter before other people had decided to care about it. She said it used to drive people around her crazy because they thought she was strange, but really she was just ahead." Marisol said, "Did she leave you anything?" Belen thought about this and said, "She left me the ability to talk to anyone, which sounds like nothing but has turned out to be worth quite a lot." Marisol said, "Yes, that sounds exactly right." She walked home from the coffee shop on those mornings through streets that were becoming familiar, accumulating the kind of familiarity that neighborhoods develop when you are present in them without urgency. When you have time to notice the cat that sat in the window of the corner building, the vendor who arranged his fruits with particular geometric precision, the tree on the turning that was currently in bloom in a color she did not have a name for, something between yellow and white, and she thought about what it meant to have time to notice things. For years she had moved through spaces without noticing them, because noticing required a portion of attention she could not spare. She had been present in the world in the way that someone very busy is present in a room, aware of the walls and the exits, and the other people primarily as information relevant to navigation, not as things worth looking at in themselves. She had not known this was happening. You did not notice the things you were not noticing. You only discovered, when the pressure lifted, what had been invisible. She was noticing things now. She found this alternately delightful and slightly painful. The way recovering from something physical could be both a relief and a confrontation with how much you had been compensating for. She noticed, for instance, that Jasmine was a different child at her new school. Not different in her fundamental character, which was fixed and clear and entirely itself, but different in the way that a plant is different when it has sufficient light. Jasmine at the old school had been careful and contained and performed adequately in all areas and had a small group of friends and had never once complained, which Marisol had taken at the time as a sign that everything was fine and now understood was simply Jasmine managing the available material. Jasmine at the new school came home with opinions about things she was learning, asked questions that required Marisol to look things up, brought home a project about colonial-era history in the Philippines that she worked on for 3 consecutive evenings, with a focused intensity that made Marisol's throat tighten with the particular pride that was sometimes indistinguishable from grief for the time lost. Clara was also different, though in ways that were louder and more immediately identifiable. She was growing a collection of plants on the balcony with the same comprehensive enthusiasm she brought to all projects, had recruited both Jasmine and Marisol into her soil management system, and had announced at dinner one Friday that she intended to become a botanist, a word she had learned that week and deployed with great confidence while buttering her bread. Marisol said that was an excellent plan. Clara said she knew. These were the textures of the new life. Not extraordinary in any single moment, but collectively, when she held them all at once and compared them to the textures of the previous life, which had been adequate and honest and full of love, but narrow in a way that was now visible in hindsight. Extraordinary in the specific sense of being more than she had believed she would be able to give them. She had believed, for years, in a future for her daughters that was defined primarily by what she hoped would not happen to them. She had hoped they would not repeat her mistakes. She had hoped they would have more choices than she had. She had hoped, in the vague and desperate way of people who are managing 1 hour at a time, that the life they ended up with would be better than the one she was currently providing. These were not small hopes. They were enormous, in fact, but they were defensive hopes, shaped by fear rather than vision. Now she had something else. She had a picture. Not a complete picture, not a detailed blueprint of every choice and achievement and year, but the sketch of something she could move toward rather than away from. She had daughters in schools that took them seriously. She had a flat with morning light. She had a financial plan that assumed a future worth planning for rather than a future that was primarily to be survived. She had time in the morning to sit at a coffee shop and not look at her phone. She had, in the language her financial advisor used, stability. And stability, as he had said, and as she now understood from the inside, was what made everything else possible. She visited her grandmother's grave on a Sunday in the 6th month, making the bus journey to the province alone. The girls at home with Aunt Celia, who had come the night before and stayed because she liked an excuse to be nearby. Marisol went in the morning and took flowers she had cut from Clara's balcony garden, which Clara had approved of after being asked, and sat by the grave for a long time in the way that people sit with someone they want to speak to, but know they can only speak near. She told her grandmother, in her head and sometimes under her breath, what had happened. All of it, in sequence, the way she might have told her on the phone, which she had done every 2 weeks for years before the call stopped, because there was no one at the other end. She told her about the appraiser and the legal document and the heritage organization and the man's face when she had quoted the number back to him slightly higher than he had offered. She told her about Dante's silence on the phone and what it had sounded like from inside. She told her about the flat and the east-facing window and the frame on the wall with Eduardo Reyes in it. She told her about Jasmine and the Colonial History Project and the look on her face when she had first walked through the gate of the new school. She told her about Clara's garden and the botanist announcement. She told her that the coffee at the shop near the flat was very good and that she went there on mornings when she was not in a hurry and sat by the window and did not look at her phone, and that she thought Lola Caring would have approved of this on principle because she had always believed that stillness was not the same as waste. She sat for a while after she had finished, in the particular quiet of old cemeteries in the province, which had a different quality from city quiet, more settled, more indifferent in the best sense, the indifference of very old things to the urgency of very recent ones. Then she said, out loud, quietly enough that only the grave and the surrounding air could hear it, "You were right about the careful, and you were right about the laughing, and I am going to see to it that my daughters are watching for a very long time." She took the bus home. The journey was 4 hours, the same as it had always been, and this time she did not count what things cost, and she looked out the window at the landscape moving past in the way that landscapes move past from bus windows when you are traveling towards something rather than away from it, steadily, in full color, with no particular urgency. Home. The word had a different weight now. Not less real, not more precious in a sentimental way, but more chosen. She had chosen this home. She had chosen this life. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic moment. But in the accumulation of careful decisions made with the quality of attention her grandmother had believed she possessed and had trusted enough to test. The tin box was on the shelf when she got home. The frame was on the wall. The girls were asleep, Clara's breathing audible from the hallway in the gentle way it always was. Marisol stood in the kitchen in the dark for a moment, the same way she used to stand in the old kitchen, but with a different quality to the dark. The old dark had been the dark of being alone with insufficient resources in a world that had not yet arranged itself in her favor. This dark was just the absence of the light she had not yet switched on. She switched it on. Eduardo Reyes looked back at her from the wall. For generations. Present day. She put the kettle on. The rest of the story was still being written. She intended to write it carefully. The news reached Dante through a cousin first, which was how most things reached Dante that he had not been told directly. The cousin was a woman named Priscilla who lived 2 streets from the house on Sampaguita Street, and who had a gift for connecting information between people who were not talking to each other, which she exercised without malice and without particular awareness that she was doing it. She had seen something online, a brief mention in a heritage newsletter that she had come across because she followed several accounts related to Philippine cultural history, and the mention had included a name she recognized. The coin was described as a recent acquisition of exceptional provenance. The newsletter used the language of institutions for which such acquisitions were routine and significant simultaneously, measured and enthusiastic in the particular way of people who worked among valuable things and had learned to speak about them without appearing to covet them. It described the coin's history in terms that were accurate to the document Marisol had signed, the provenance attribution she had required as a condition of the sale. Eduardo Reyes. Benguet Province. For generations of the Reyes family. Priscilla sent a message to a group that included Dante and several other cousins asking if this was their family. She included a screenshot of the newsletter section that referenced the coin. She added, at the end of the message, a simple question mark and a series of exclamation points, which together communicated the full range of her emotional response to the information. Dante read the message on a Tuesday evening. He was sitting in the living room of his house in the subdivision, his sons doing homework at the dining table, his wife somewhere in the back of the house. He read the message twice. He looked at the screenshot. He put his phone face down on the cushion beside him and looked at the television, which was on but which he had not been watching. Then he picked the phone up again and read it a third time. The newsletter had not specified the sale price. Institutional publications of this kind rarely did, understanding that specific numbers were more likely to provoke controversy than appreciation. But the language used to describe the acquisition's significance, phrases indicating the coin's status as one of only 4 surviving authenticated examples of its particular minting, combined with the knowledge Marisol had shared with him in their phone call months earlier, was sufficient for him to construct, if not an exact number, then a range. And the range was significant enough that he sat with his phone face down again for several minutes before he was ready to resume being in the room in the ordinary way. He did not call Marisol that evening. He was aware, in the particular self-conscious way of people who know they are being observed by their own better judgment, that any call he made that evening would be conducted from a position of emotional response that he had not yet adequately managed. He was not a cruel man. He was not a dishonest man. But he was a man who had laughed at a bread box at a funeral and had since had occasion to think about that laugh more than he would have chosen to. He called her on Thursday, having given himself 2 days to arrive at the version of himself that could make the call correctly. He said that he had seen the newsletter. He said that he wanted to tell her, and he meant this. He had worked to mean this before he dialed, that he was proud of her. He said that he had not understood what the box contained, and that he recognized his reaction at the funeral had been thoughtless. He used the word thoughtless deliberately, having considered and rejected several alternatives that were either more defensive or more self-flagellating than the situation warranted. Marisol said she appreciated him calling. He said he meant it about being proud. He said that what she had done, the patience of it, the research, the way she had handled all of it without asking anyone for help or advice, was not something he was sure he would have been capable of. She said she thought he probably would have been capable of it. She said she thought most people were more capable than they believed when the circumstances required it. He said, "You're being generous." She said, "I'm being accurate. There's a difference." He laughed, briefly, a different laugh from the one at the funeral. This one was the laugh of someone recognizing a truth at their own expense and choosing not to resist it. She asked about his sons, and he asked about the girls, and they talked for 20 minutes and said goodbye in the way of siblings who have arrived, after some difficulty, at a more honest version of their relationship. Rochelle called the next day, having apparently seen the same newsletter through a different route, a friend who followed heritage accounts for professional reasons related to her boyfriend's real estate work. Her call was shorter and more effusive and contained within its effusiveness a quality of relief that Marisol recognized as the relief of someone who had been carrying a small guilt and was glad to have found a context in which to set it down. She said, "Marisol, I can't believe it. The whole time it was in that box." Marisol said yes, that was where it had been. Rochelle said, "You must have been so shocked when you opened it." Marisol thought about sitting at the kitchen table at midnight with a butter knife working the rusted hinge and the cheesecloth and the weight of the coins in her hands and the refrigerator humming and the city going quiet. She said, "I took my time with it." Rochelle said that was so like her, always so calm, always so steady, and said it in the way she said things that were compliments and acknowledgments simultaneously, the way of someone who was revising a story about someone else in real time and finding the revision more flattering to herself than the original. Marisol said she was glad they had talked and she hoped Rochelle and her boyfriend were well, and the call came to its natural end. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and felt the particular quiet of having finished something. Not something large and dramatic. Something small and necessary. The correction of a record that had been slightly wrong for a long time. Dante and Rochelle had laughed, or something adjacent to laughing, at the bread box. They now knew what the bread box had held. The knowledge had arrived at them in the way her grandmother had anticipated, through the back channels of the world, through newsletters and cousins, and the ordinary machinery of information making its way to the people it concerned. She had not engineered this. She had not needed to. The thing had taken care of itself, the way things that were true tended to eventually. She felt no satisfaction in the theatrical sense. She had not wanted them to feel bad. She had not wanted any particular confrontation or reversal of fortune that required witnesses and drama. What she had wanted, without being fully articulate about it at the time, was simply for the record to be accurate, for the people who had dismissed the breadbox to understand that their dismissal had been a mistake, not a moral failing, not a crime, a mistake, born of insufficient attention to the thing they were looking at. The record was now accurate. She was finished with that part. The Heritage Organization's newsletter had, without intending to, done something that Marisol had neither planned nor anticipated. It had made the story public in a small, specialist way that nonetheless had connective tissue to a larger world. The newsletter circulated among collectors, historians, academics, and institutional professionals, and the language it used about the coin's provenance had caught the attention of a journalist at a publication that covered Philippine cultural history and heritage. The journalist reached out to Marisol through the Heritage Organization, which forwarded the message with a note saying only that they had no obligation to respond and that the organization would support whatever decision she made. She had never been contacted by a journalist before. She held the message for 2 days, reading it occasionally, evaluating it with the same unhurried carefulness she brought to all evaluations. The journalist's name was a woman. Her message was professional, not sensational, and what she wanted was not the story of the money, which she acknowledged up front was not the story she was interested in. What she was interested in was the provenance, the family history, the 4 generations, the mining labor and colonial period, and the chain of women who had kept the box. She said she was working on a series about inherited objects and the histories embedded in them, about the way material things carried the evidence of lives that would otherwise go unrecorded. She said she thought Marisol's family story was an important example of something she was trying to document about how working-class Filipino families of the colonial era had preserved and transmitted value across generations in ways that official history had not captured. Marisol read this paragraph several times. She thought about Eduardo Reyes framed on the wall. She thought about the provenance section of the authentication certificate. Originally in the possession of Eduardo Reyes, laborer, Benguet Province, Philippine Islands. She thought about the word laborer, about 11 years in a mountain, about gold paid instead of paper because someone had understood, long before economists formalized it, that trust was the only real currency and that trust required collateral. She called the appraiser, whom she had come to think of as a reliable source of perspective. She asked what she thought. The appraiser said that the journalist's publication was reputable and that the framing she had described sounded like genuine historical journalism rather than a celebrity story. She said, "I think the question is whether you want Eduardo Reyes's name in a broader record than the museum certificate, and whether you want your grandmother's name in it, and your own." Marisol sat with this. She called Aunt Celia and read her the journalist's message. Celia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother kept that box hidden for 60 years because she was afraid of what people would do if they knew. She was afraid it would be taken or challenged, or that someone with more power than her would find a way to call it theirs. She hid it because the world she lived in made hiding necessary." She said, "But you're in a different world. Not a perfect one, but different. And Eduardo spent 11 years in that mountain, and nobody outside this family has ever known his name." Marisol said, "You think I should talk to her?" Celia said, "I think Eduardo Reyes worked in a mine for 11 years and sent money home and paid in gold because he was wiser than the system he was working inside. And I think he deserves to have his name somewhere that is not just a family photograph and a museum certificate." Marisol agreed to the interview. It took place over 3 sessions, each one at the coffee shop near the flat, with Belen making the coffees and occasionally bringing a second cup without being asked. The journalist was precise and patient and asked questions that required real thought rather than the performative recitation of a prepared story. She was interested in the texture of things. She asked what it had felt like to hold the coins for the first time. She asked about the cheesecloth and why Marisol thought her grandmother had chosen that particular material. She asked about the moment of reading the letter and what it was like to discover that you had been chosen for a specific reason and what that reason was. Marisol answered all of it as honestly as she was able, which was honestly enough to sometimes surprise herself. She talked about the count of the coins, the slow counting in the kitchen light. She talked about being 34 and feeling 60. She talked about choosing rice over beans and walking 6 blocks because bus fare was $1.50 and she did not have $1.50. She talked about Lola Caring pressing her palm flat against her cheek and saying you have the kind of patience that God gives to people he trusts with hard things. She talked about Eduardo Reyes and the mountain and the wire on the box that became electrical tape, and she talked about the women who had passed it forward, each one handing something to the next without knowing what the next would need it to become. She talked about her daughters. She talked about Jasmine at the gate of the new school saying, "I am not scared of different." She talked about Clara declaring herself a botanist while buttering bread. She talked about the balcony garden and the morning light through the east-facing window and the frame on the wall. She talked about the careful. She talked about what it meant to be named by the person who had known you best as the most careful, and how that had felt at the time like being given a modest consolation prize, and how it had turned out to be the most precise and accurate and valuable thing anyone had ever said about her. The journalist listened to all of it. She asked, toward the end of the third session, what Marisol would want someone reading the story to take from it. Marisol thought about this for a long time. Long enough that Belen brought a third coffee without being asked and set it down quietly and went back behind the counter. She said, "I think I want them to understand that the overlooked things are not overlooked because they have no value. They are overlooked because the people looking don't know what they're seeing. That's a problem with the people looking, not with the thing." She said, "My grandmother knew what she had. She kept it safe for 60 years. She chose who it went to with more accuracy and intelligence than most people apply to decisions that are considered important." And the people in that room laughed at a tin box because it looked like nothing, and all of them, every single one, had less vision in that moment than an 81-year-old woman who had spent 6 decades seeing exactly what was in front of her. She said, "The lesson is not that you should always look for hidden treasure. The lesson is that you should pay attention to what you're dismissing and why. Because the thing you laugh at might be the thing that matters." The journalist wrote this down. She looked up from her notebook. She said, "That's your grandmother's lesson, isn't it? Not yours." Marisol considered this. Then she said, "It's mine now." The article was published 6 weeks later. Marisol read it at the kitchen table on a Friday morning before the girls were awake, with the first coffee of the day and the east-facing light coming through the window at its particular angle. The journalist had written it with the same precision and patience she had brought to the interviews, and the result was a piece that was not about fortune or luck or the dramatic reversal of circumstances in the way that such stories were typically framed. It was about labor, about knowledge passed silently between generations of people who did not have access to the official channels through which knowledge was usually preserved. About a man named Eduardo Reyes who had understood something about value that was more accurate and durable than the financial systems operating around him, and who had expressed that understanding by sealing a tin box with wire and handing it to his wife. The article named him. It named Lola Caring. It named Marisol. It named Jasmine and Clara without identifying details, referred to only as Marisol's daughters, the 4th generation. It quoted the provenance certificate and the heritage organization's authentication documentation. It included a photograph of the tin box, which Marisol had agreed to provide, and which the journalist had photographed herself, sitting on the kitchen table in the morning light, dull and grimy and entirely unimpressive, looking exactly like what it appeared to be on its surface and nothing like what it actually was. The photograph was the thing people responded to most strongly. It circulated in a way that the article itself, dense and historical and requiring sustained attention, did not quite circulate on its own. People shared the photograph with captions that ranged from the historically aware to the simply amazed, people who had never heard of colonial-era Philippine coinage or numismatic appraisal or the mining operations of Benguet province, but who recognized, in a tin box that looked like nothing, something that resonated with a knowledge they had carried about overlooked things. Marisol was not on social media in any significant way and did not track the circulation in real time. She knew it was circulating because Celia called with the kind of excitement in her voice she reserved for genuinely surprising developments, and because Belen at the coffee shop mentioned that several customers had come in talking about an article they had read, and because Priscilla, who monitored these things as a form of personal calling, sent a long message to the family group describing the reach of the piece with statistics and observations and a set of exclamation points that felt like applause. She also knew it was circulating because the journalist sent her a message, measured and professional and warm, saying that the response had been larger than anticipated and that she had received inquiries from 2 other publications interested in republication rights, and asking whether Marisol had any thoughts or preferences about further coverage. Marisol said that the story had been told and that she did not feel the need for additional coverage, but that she had no objection to republication of the existing piece if the journalist wished to pursue it. She said she only asked that Eduardo Reyes's name remain in any version that ran. The journalist said that was not something she would allow to be removed regardless. Marisol said she had not thought it would be. She had asked for the form of it. The journalist said, "You're still being careful." Marisol said, "I intend to keep being careful. It has worked out reasonably well." What she did not say, and did not need to say because the journalist was perceptive enough to have already written it, was that being careful was not a moderate or consolatory quality. It was, in the specific form that her grandmother had identified it, and that she had exercised it, a form of power. The power of sustained attention. The power of not being hurried into decisions that served other people's timelines. The power of knowing what you had before you decided what to do with it. The power of waiting until the right moment, which was not the same as waiting out of fear. Eduardo Reyes had been careful in a mountain in Benguet for 11 years. He had been careful about which metal to trust and which paper to distrust. He had been careful about who held what he had accumulated. Lola Caring had been careful for 60 years on a kitchen shelf. Marisol had been careful through the appraisals and the legal filing and the negotiation and the signing, through the financial plan and the school selection and the move, through the interview and the reading of the article and all the days in between. Careful was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the thing. The Heritage Organization invited her to the public display of the coin 3 months after the article ran. The display was part of a larger exhibition on colonial-era material culture, objects that had been used, preserved, and transmitted by Filipino families during the Spanish and American periods, the accumulation of ordinary life in extraordinary circumstances. The coin was not the centerpiece of the exhibition, which covered a broad range of objects and histories, but it had a dedicated section that referenced the authentication and the provenance and the Reyes family history, accompanied by the framed provenance text and a reproduction of the photograph of the tin box. She attended with Jasmine. Clara was 6 and still at the age where museums required more energy management than was compatible with a peaceful visit, and Aunt Celia came to stay with her so that the occasion could be what it deserved to be, which was quiet and attentive and something Jasmine would carry forward. They took the bus because the bus route ran directly to the museum and because Marisol saw no particular reason to change her relationship to public transport simply because her financial circumstances had changed. She had always found the bus clarifying. It moved at the speed of the city rather than above it, and the city was, she had always believed, most honestly experienced from within. Jasmine sat beside her and looked out the window with her particular quality of noticing, and when they arrived at the museum and walked through the entrance and found the colonial-era exhibition in the second gallery on the left, Jasmine moved through the space with the same deliberate attention she had given to the school visit, stopping at each display for exactly as long as she needed to before moving on. When they reached the section with the coin, Jasmine stopped and looked at it for a long time. The coin sat in its vitrine, lit from below with the specific, reverent light that museums gave to things they considered significant. It was smaller than it seemed in photographs, small enough that the grandeur of what it had accumulated over its history was entirely invisible in its physical form. It was just a coin, old and golden and serious, the kind of serious that came from age rather than from any inherent quality. Its label read the dates and the minting information and the provenance, and at the bottom, in the standardized font of museum attribution, originally in the possession of Eduardo Reyes, laborer, Benguet Province, Philippine Islands. Jasmine read the label. Then she looked at the coin. Then she looked at her mother. She said, "He really had no idea what would happen." Marisol said, "No, he had no way of knowing." Jasmine said, "But he kept it safe anyway." Marisol said, "Yes, he kept it safe anyway." Jasmine looked back at the coin. She said, "I want to know more about him." Marisol said she had been thinking about that too. She said that the journalist had told her, at the end of the third interview session, that the Heritage Organization had a research program that could potentially help trace records from the Benguet mining operations of the colonial period, employment documents, labor records, the kind of administrative paperwork that colonial operations kept for their own purposes and that had been archived without anyone having reason to examine them closely. She said she had made a preliminary inquiry and that the organization was interested in following it up. Jasmine said, "So we might find out more about him." Marisol said they might. She said there were no guarantees. Records from that period were incomplete and inconsistently preserved, and the labor of men like Eduardo Reyes was not the kind of labor that colonial administration documented with particular care. But there was enough of the administrative infrastructure remaining that threads could sometimes be pulled. Jasmine nodded. She said, "I think we should try." Marisol said she agreed. They stood together at the vitrine for a while longer, the coin in its careful light, the label with his name in the standardized font. Outside, in the rest of the museum and beyond it the rest of the city, things continued at their ordinary pace, indifferent and proceeding. But here, in this specific spot, a chain of attention had been completed. A man had worked in a mountain and kept what he earned in a tin box, and it had traveled forward through 4 generations of careful hands and arrived in a vitrine with a label that said his name. Not a famous name. Not a name that changed the shape of history in the way that other names changed the shape of history, but a name, present and documented and no longer belonging only to the narrow private record of a family, but to the broader record of a people who had survived and preserved and passed things forward through circumstances that had not been designed for their survival. Eduardo Reyes, laborer. Present. They had lunch after the museum at a place nearby that Jasmine chose from a shortlist Marisol offered her, exercising the preference with the confidence of someone who had recently discovered that her preferences were considered relevant information. She ordered something with confidence and ate it with the focused pleasure of someone who intended to remember it, and Marisol watched her and thought about what it looked like to grow up in a life where your preferences were considered, where the question of what you wanted was asked and waited for rather than preempted by what was available. She was still learning what this looked like, from the inside and from the outside. She suspected she would be learning for a long time. The shift from one kind of life to another was not a single event, but an ongoing adjustment, and some adjustments were slower than others, and some things that had been formed by scarcity did not dissolve simply because scarcity had been removed. She noticed this in herself sometimes. The reflex to calculate before choosing. The instinct to minimize her own preferences in advance of being asked to. The slight internal flinch at expenditure even when the expenditure was reasonable and planned. These were not failures. They were the marks of the life she had actually lived, and she had learned enough about herself to treat them as information rather than as verdicts. She had told the financial advisor about this, not the specific reflexes, but the general phenomenon of a person formed by one set of circumstances trying to operate in a different set. He had said that this was very common and that it tended to resolve over time, not entirely and not uniformly, but sufficiently. He said that people were more adaptable than they were usually given credit for, and that the form adaptation took was rarely the dramatic erasure of what had come before, but rather the gradual accumulation of a new layer over the existing structure, like growth over old wood. She thought this was accurate. She was still herself. She was still the woman who chose rice over beans and walked 6 blocks and put her daughters to bed under a low ceiling and measured the cost of things against resources that could not absorb mistakes. That woman was not gone. She had been the one who opened the box carefully and counted the coins slowly and called the appraiser and did not accept the first offer. She had been the one who filed the legal document and made the appointment and rode the bus to the museum with her daughter and ordered a second coffee at the cafe on the mornings she was not in a hurry. That woman had done all of this. She was still doing it. She was simply doing it now with a wider field. Jasmine asked, over lunch, what the heritage research might actually find. She asked this with the practical curiosity she brought to all questions that had an uncertain answer, wanting to understand the range of possibilities rather than a single predetermined outcome. Marisol said they might find employment records with his name, dates of work, the mine he had been assigned to, the rate of pay. They might find a physical description if the administration had recorded such things. They might find nothing because records were lost and damaged and sometimes simply never made in the first place. She said that the mining operations of the colonial period were known to be particularly inconsistent in their labor documentation because the administration's interest was in production rather than in workers. Jasmine said that was unjust. Marisol said yes, it was. Jasmine said, but we know he was there. We know what he did. The coin proves it. Marisol said that was exactly right. She said that was what the appraiser had meant about provenance, about the importance of a traceable family history. The coin's value was not only in its material and its rarity. It was in the fact that it could be connected to a specific person and a specific story, and that the connection could be documented and verified. Eduardo Reyes had not left a written account of his life. He had left a gold coin in a tin box, and the coin had carried the account forward in the only language it had available, which was the language of presence and preservation, of a thing maintained and passed on rather than spent or lost. She said, some people write their lives down. Some people leave objects. He left an object, and the object said he was there. Jasmine thought about this carefully. Then she said, I'm going to write mine down. Marisol asked what she meant. Jasmine said she had been keeping a notebook since the beginning of the year, since the conversation about the coins and Lola Caring and Eduardo Reyes in the mountain. She said she was writing things down, what happened, and also what she noticed about what was happening, because she thought noticing was important and she thought it was worth keeping. Marisol sat with this for a moment. She said, your great-great-grandmother kept a tin box. Your great-grandmother kept a tin box. I kept the tin box. And you're going to keep a notebook. Jasmine said, different container, same idea. Marisol looked at her daughter across the lunch table, 9 years old and entirely clear about herself and her intentions, and felt the full, unguarded version of the feeling she had been feeling in various degrees since the day she had opened the bread box and sat in the kitchen with the coins and the refrigerator humming and the city going quiet. It was not happiness, though it contained happiness. It was not relief, though it contained relief. It was not vindication, though it contained that too, the quiet completion of her grandmother's final instruction. See to it that your daughters are watching when they do. And her daughters were watching. They were both watching, Clara with her garden and her conviction and her botanist's future, Jasmine with her notebook and her careful noticing and her understanding, at 9 years old, that different containers could carry the same essential thing. It was something that did not fit neatly into a single word. The feeling of a chain that had been maintained. The feeling of a care that had been paid forward correctly. The feeling of standing in the right place at the right time, not by luck, but by being the person who had been prepared, over the course of an entire life, to recognize and receive exactly this. Her grandmother had seen it in her before she had seen it in herself. That was the gift. Not just the coins, not just the money, not just the stability and the schools and the morning light and the frame on the wall. The gift was the seeing. The gift was being looked at by someone who knew what she was looking at and saying, this one. This is the one who will know what to do. She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Jasmine's, not in the way of comfort or reassurance, but in the way of one person communicating to another person that they have been seen. Jasmine looked at her and did not say anything, because she did not need to. They took the bus home in the afternoon, through the city that moved at its own pace around them. The vendor with his geometric fruit arrangement, the tree on the turning in its color that was between yellow and white, the buildings accumulating their ordinary daylight. Jasmine read something on the bus. Marisol looked out the window and let the city pass and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself something, the luxury of a mind that was not required to be calculating, that could simply receive what was in front of it without immediately converting it into a problem to solve. At home, Clara was on the balcony with Celia, showing her the plants in the detailed and somewhat relentless way that Clara showed people things she cared about, explaining the watering schedule and the light requirements, and the name of each plant in the system she had developed, which involved small handwritten labels on popsicle sticks. Celia was listening with the complete, generous attention she gave to children who needed to be taken seriously, which was all children, and which was a quality Marisol had loved in her aunt her entire life. Marisol made tea and brought it out to the balcony, and the four of them sat in the afternoon light. The city spread below them at a manageable distance, the plants in their labeled pots, the conversation moving between Clara's botany and Celia's garden and what Jasmine and Marisol had seen at the museum, and then on to other things, ordinary things, The accumulation of a late afternoon in a life that was being lived at a pace that permitted such afternoons. At some point, in the comfortable middle of the conversation, Celia said, "Your grandmother would have been very content to see this." Marisol said she thought so too. Celia said, "Not just the circumstances. This. The table. The four of us." Marisol looked at the table. Clara's elbows on it, explaining something. Jasmine's notebook opened beside her cup. She had brought it to the table, a habit Marisol recognized as the particular habit of someone who wanted to be ready to write something down at any moment. The tea, the light, the city in the distance, the plant labels in Clara's handwriting. She said yes. She thought this was exactly what Lola Caring would have wanted to see. The tin bread box was on the kitchen shelf inside. Third shelf. In plain sight now. Not hidden behind anything. Just sitting there in its ordinary, grimy, unimpressive way, looking like the nothing it had always been told it was and refusing, as it had always refused, to actually be that. Eduardo Reyes had put things in it more than a century ago. His wife had kept it. Her daughter had kept it. Lola Caring had kept it for 60 years. Marisol had taken it from a kitchen shelf at a funeral and carried it home on a bus while Clara slept against her arm and Jasmine watched the dark highway. And she had opened it at midnight with a butter knife and found what it contained and been careful with it. In the precise way that careful was meant, in the way that made everything possible. The chain had not broken. It had simply changed what it was carrying. She intended to keep it unbroken. She intended this not as a sentiment, but as a decision, of the kind she had learned to make clearly and without drama, the kind that was made once and then lived rather than made repeatedly in search of reassurance. The notebook on the table, the garden on the balcony, the frame on the wall inside, the plan with the financial advisor, the schools, the morning coffee and the east-facing window, and the name in the standardized font of a museum label that anyone could come to read. Eduardo Reyes, laborer, present, for generations and counting. The afternoon continued. Clara explained the watering schedule. Jasmine wrote something in her notebook. Celia finished her tea and asked for more. The city did its ordinary things in the distance. And Marisol, 34 years old and no longer feeling 60, sat in the afternoon light on the balcony of the home she had chosen in the life she was building, and let all of it be exactly what it was. Which was enough. Which was everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. In the weeks that followed the museum visit, something shifted in the way Marisol moved through the world that she did not immediately have language for. It was not dramatic. Nothing about her life now was dramatic in the theatrical sense, which was, she had come to understand, one of the signs that things were actually going well. Drama, in her experience, was what happened when stability was absent and people were forced to manage crises in real time. The absence of drama was the presence of structure, of the kind that held without requiring constant visible maintenance. What shifted was something quieter, a quality of permission. She had spent so many years operating within extremely narrow bands of what she allowed herself to want, to expect, to plan for, to grieve when it didn't arrive. Those bands had been a survival mechanism. They had kept her from the particular devastation of hoping for things she could not have, which was a real devastation, and she did not dismiss it. But they had also kept her from the full exercise of her own imagination. She had not let herself imagine, in any substantive way, what she would want if wanting was permitted. She was learning to want things. It was slower than she expected, more measured, like the gradual opening of a window that had been sealed for a long time, letting in air carefully, not all at once. She wanted to learn something. This was the first clearly formed want that arrived in those weeks, specific and actionable. She wanted to learn something she did not already know for a purpose that was not instrumental, not because it would help her earn money or manage a situation, but because it interested her. She had not allowed herself this category of desire for years, the desire to know something simply for the sake of knowing it. Knowledge that did not have an immediate application had been a luxury she had not been able to justify. She enrolled in a course. It was an evening course at an institution near the flat, offered once a week, on Philippine history and material culture. She had found it through the Heritage Organization's newsletter, which she had subscribed to in the weeks after the article ran. The course was taught by a woman whose name she recognized from the acknowledgments section of a book she had found in the museum's gift shop and bought on the day of the visit. She went to the first session on a Thursday evening. Jasmine in charge at home for 2 hours, which Jasmine handled with the calm authority of someone who had been waiting for the responsibility to be formally recognized. The classroom was small, and the other students were a mixture of ages and backgrounds, some with professional reasons for attending, historians and archivists and educators, and some, like Marisol, who were there because the subject had reached into their lives from an unexpected angle and pulled. The instructor was methodical and knowledgeable and had the specific quality of enthusiasm that specialists develop for their own field when they have spent enough time in it to understand how much remains unknown. She talked, in the first session, about the problem of the archive, about who had been recorded and who had not, about the gap between official history, which documented what power considered worth documenting, and the lived history of ordinary people who had left traces in objects and oral accounts and material culture rather than in written records. She said, "The objects that survive are the record. Sometimes they are the only record, and if we do not read them carefully, we miss most of what actually happened." Marisol wrote this in the notebook she had brought, the one she had started keeping because Jasmine had a notebook and because she understood, watching her daughter, that the impulse was right. After the session, she spoke briefly to the instructor, explaining, in the compressed way she had learned to explain things when there was a limited amount of time, the connection between the course content and her own family history. The instructor said that what she described was precisely the kind of case that material historians were trying to recover and document, that the coin in the Heritage Organization's collection was, in fact, a subject of ongoing academic interest precisely because of its authenticated provenance and the clarity of the family chain that had preserved it. She said, "Eduardo Reyes is now a primary source, not because anyone recorded him, but because what he did was preserved clearly enough to be documented now. That is exceptionally rare." Marisol held this on the bus home. A primary source, a man in a mountain 100 years ago, working and saving and sealing a tin box with wire, had become, through the patience of the women who kept what he left, a primary source. The administrative record had not thought him worth noting. The object had noted him instead. She got home and paid Jasmine the agreed-upon babysitting rate, which they had negotiated seriously and settled at a number that Jasmine had researched with the thoroughness she brought to negotiations she considered significant. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and told Jasmine about the session in the detail that Jasmine's listening warranted. Jasmine said, "So he's in the historical record now?" Marisol said yes. Jasmine said, "Because of the coin." Marisol said, "Because of the coin and because of every person who kept the coin and because of the appraiser who documented it properly and because of the Heritage Organization that made the acquisition and because of you. Actually, indirectly, because if I had not had daughters to provide for, I might not have been as careful about all of it." Jasmine looked at her mother with the expression she wore when she was processing something she would write down later. She said, "So we're in the historical record too." Marisol said, "In a way. The provenance says 4 generations of the Reyes family. That includes you." Jasmine nodded with the gravity of someone accepting a responsibility. She said, "I'm going to have to be careful with the notebook." Marisol said yes. She said that careful was, as they had established, the family characteristic. Jasmine said, "Clara too." Marisol said Clara's contribution would probably be expressed through the botanical record, but that this was a valid form of careful. Jasmine smiled the small private smile. The heritage research into Eduardo Reyes's employment records came back 3 months later. The archival team had found 3 documents referencing him in the Benguet labor registers of the relevant period. A wage record, with his name in a colonial administrator's handwriting beside a daily rate. A supervisor's notation citing a worker named Reyes for the efficiency of his method during a difficult or extraction. A health record noting a respiratory illness in his 2nd year and his return to work the following month. 3 documents. 11 years of labor. The rest had not been kept, or had been lost, or had never been created because the administration had not considered the individual worth the paper. But 3. His name, written down by someone else's hand, surviving 100 years to be found by an archivist looking on behalf of his great-great-granddaughter. He had been there. The coin had said so. Now the archive said so, In the partial and imperfect way, archives confirmed the existence of people who were not considered their primary subject. Marisol read the report at the kitchen table on the morning it arrived, before the girls were awake, with the east-facing light and the first coffee. She read it the way she read things that required careful attention, slowly and more than once, not rushing past the parts that were technical or incomplete or difficult. She read the wage record 3 times, the number beside his name, the daily rate that translated, in current terms, to very little, the rate of a man whose labor was worth less to the system than the ore he extracted. She looked at the frame on the wall. Eduardo Reyes, laborer, Benguet province. She thought about the gap between the wage record and the coin, between what the system had valued him at and what he had understood himself to be worth. He had known that what he was accumulating was worth more than the paper system would acknowledge, and he had kept it in a form that the paper system could not easily control, and he had given it forward into a future he could not see, trusting that the future would know what to do with it. She poured a second coffee. She sat with the report and the frame and the tin box on the shelf and the morning light and the city beginning its day outside the window. She was 34 years old, and she was in the middle of a life she had built from a tin box that everyone else had laughed at. And every morning she sat at this table and looked at the frame and the box and was reminded, with a regularity that never became dull, that careful was not a small thing, that patience was not passive, that the overlooked were not without value, and that the people who laughed at what they did not understand would stop laughing eventually. They had stopped laughing. Her grandmother had told her to make sure her daughters were watching when they did. Her daughters were watching. One of them was writing it down. She planned to keep it that way. Outside, the city continued. The vendor arranged his fruit. The tree on the turning held its color between yellow and white. Belen at the coffee shop was probably already behind the counter, the machines starting their morning sounds, the first customers arriving with their ordinary needs and their ordinary mornings. The Heritage Organization's building was open, the coin in its vitrine with its label and its light. The new schools were preparing for another day. The balcony garden was catching the morning sun, all of it proceeding, all of it held together by the accumulated weight of careful attention, passed forward from hand to hand across more than a century, from a mountain in Benguet to a kitchen table in Manila, from wire to electrical tape to cheesecloth to velvet to the legal precision of a museum provenance certificate. Eduardo Reyes had started the chain. Marisol Reyes was keeping it. Jasmine Reyes was writing it down. Clara Reyes was growing things on a balcony and had declared, with the absolute conviction of someone who did not yet know how to doubt herself, that she would be a botanist. The tin bread box sat on the third shelf of the kitchen cabinet and looked exactly like nothing and was, as it had always been, the container of everything. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story. There was one more thing that happened, smaller than all the others in its external form, larger than most of them in what it meant. It happened on an unremarkable Wednesday evening when Marisol came home from her course to find both girls at the kitchen table, not doing homework, not drawing. They were looking at the tin bread box, which Clara had placed on a piece of cloth in the center of the table with the deliberate staging she applied to things she considered ceremonially significant. Jasmine had her notebook open. Clara said, "We want to know how it works. The keeping. How did Lola Caring know to keep it and not use it?" Marisol sat across from them and said, "I think you keep the things that are worth more than what you could get for them right now." Clara thought about this carefully and said, "Like the plants. If I use the seeds right away, I'd only get one plant. But if I keep the seeds and plant more, I get more plants." Marisol said, "Yes. Exactly like that." Clara wrote something on her piece of paper in the large, clear letters of a 6-year-old newly confident in her own handwriting. She showed it to Jasmine. Marisol leaned across to read it. It said, "Keep the seeds." Marisol looked at her daughters on either side of the tin box in the kitchen light. Jasmine with her notebook and her careful noticing. Clara with her paper and her pencil and her botanical understanding of patience and return. The box between them, dull and ordinary, and carrying everything. She thought about Eduardo Reyes in the mountain. The wire. The bus fare. The butter knife at midnight. The room going quiet before the laugh. Gold does not lie. She said, "That is exactly right. Keep the seeds." Clara looked satisfied in the complete way of someone who has understood something that will stay understood. Jasmine wrote it in her notebook. The careful letters, the full stop at the end. The evening settled into the ordinary rhythms of a Wednesday. Dinner, the particular negotiations of two children who had different opinions about what constituted a sufficient quantity of vegetables, the reading before bed, the good night, the particular quiet that fell when both girls were asleep and the flat belonged, for a few hours, to the quality of its own stillness. Marisol sat at the table after and did not do anything for a while. Just sat in the kitchen with the box on the shelf where they had put it back, and the frame on the wall, and the evening light through the window that was different from the morning light, softer and less directed, the light of endings rather than beginnings. She was the ending of one story and the beginning of another. She understood this not as a burden but as a location, the specific place on a chain where one set of hands released and another set held. The chain before her had been made of remarkable people doing unremarkable seeming things, keeping boxes, maintaining silence, choosing carefully, waiting as long as necessary. The chain after her was being made right now, in a notebook on a nightstand in the next room, in a piece of paper that said, "Keep the seeds," in large, clear letters on a child's desk. She had not ended the story of Eduardo Reyes by selling his coin. She had put it somewhere it would be seen and his name somewhere it would be read. She had not ended the story of Lola Caring by inheriting the box. She had continued it, in the way that stories worth continuing were meant to be continued, by carrying the essential thing forward in a form appropriate to the next generation. The tin box was still ugly. It was still dull and grimy and visually entirely without distinction. It looked like something you would pass over at a sale without picking up. It looked exactly like nothing. It was, as it had always been, exactly everything. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. The chain held. It would keep holding. That was the whole point. That was, it turned out, enough to base a life on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.